a quiet clerk, a vanished jogger, and a town gripped by terror. This is the story of Daniel Reed, the man no one suspected. Emily Carter, the bright young jogger who disappeared one rainy night, became his first victim. Mark Holloway, a hardworking diner employee, never made it home after his late shift. Detective Sarah Mitchell, relentless in her pursuit, pieced together the chilling puzzle of strange symbols and silent trails. In Millbrook, fear grew while Daniel lived unnoticed among them. This is not just a story of crimes. It's the unraveling of how a normal man turned into a monster. Daniel Reed lived in the quiet suburbs of Millbrook, a place where neighbors waved at each other from across trimmed lawns, and where the loudest sound at night was the hum of crickets. To anyone passing by, Daniel was just another ordinary man. He wore plain clothes, kept to himself, and worked at the local hardware store where his responsibilities were simple and repetitive. Customers remembered him as polite, sometimes forgettable, the kind of person who blended into the background of life. He paid his bills on time, returned his library books before the due date, and was never late to work. Nothing about him seemed unusual, and that was exactly what made him invisible. For most of his life, Daniel carried this image of quiet normalcy. He lived alone in a modest house left to him by his late parents. The house was clean but bare, the walls decorated with little more than old calendars and a few family photos gathering dust. His evenings were predictable. He ate dinner at the same hour, watched television without much interest, and went to bed early. People in Millbrook often said Daniel was harmless, the kind of man who would never hurt anyone. They believed it, and in a way, Daniel believed it too. But inside him lay a silence that was not peace, but emptiness. The spark that woke the darkness came unexpectedly. One rainy evening, while searching through the attic for a flashlight during a power cut, Daniel stumbled across a dusty box filled with old belongings. Inside, among faded photographs and broken toys, he found his childhood diary. The cover was torn, the pages yellowed with age, but the words inside carried the sting of old wounds. As he read, memories returned with striking clarity. Schoolyard taunts, the sting of being left out, the humiliation of being mocked for his quietness. Page after page revealed a younger Daniel who had been crushed by loneliness and rejection. He had written about classmates who laughed at him, about teachers who overlooked him, and about nights when he cried himself to sleep. At first, reading the diary felt like revisiting a ghost, a reminder of things long buried. But the more Daniel read, the stronger the emotions became. He felt anger bubbling, not only at the children who had hurt him, but at the entire world that had ignored him. The ordinary life he had built seemed hollow now, as if it had all been a disguise for someone who had never truly been accepted. Each page of the diary was like a match striking inside his mind, reigniting a fire he didn't know was still burning. What began as quiet reflection soon turned into obsession. Daniel started to dwell on the injustice of his past, replaying the insults and rejections in his mind. He convinced himself that the world had made him invisible, and invisibility was no longer something he could tolerate. In the stillness of that attic, surrounded by forgotten relics of childhood, Daniel Reed began to transform. He was no longer just a man living a quiet, unnoticed life. The diary had awakened a darkness that had waited patiently for years, and once awake, it would not return to silence. Daniel's days remained outwardly unchanged, but within him a dangerous shift had begun. He still arrived at the hardware store each morning, still stacked shelves with screws and nails, still nodded politely to familiar customers. Yet behind his tired eyes was a new world forming, one in which he no longer felt like a victim of invisibility. The bitterness he had uncovered in his diary gave him a strange kind of energy. It was as though the quiet man who had once drifted unnoticed through life had been replaced by someone who wanted to see and control everything around him. His evenings grew longer, and sleep became less important. Instead of resting, Daniel walked the streets of Millbrook after sunset, wandering with no clear destination. He learned the rhythms of the town when it was at its most vulnerable. He noticed the woman who jogged at the same time every night, her headphones muting the world around her. He watched the couple who returned late from work, their laughter breaking the silence as they unlocked their door. He observed the neighbor who left her window open, unaware of how clearly the light inside revealed her life. To most people, these were insignificant details. To Daniel, they became pieces of a puzzle. Watching strangers filled him with a sense of control he had never known. For once, he was not the one being overlooked. He was the one observing, studying, holding secrets that no one else realized were being gathered. Soon his observations were not enough. He began recording them in notebooks, carefully noting times, routes, and habits. His handwriting filled pages with maps of streets and schedules of lives that did not belong to him. Each note made him feel more powerful, as if the simple act of knowing someone's routine gave him ownership over their existence. The idea of acting on these thoughts crept into his mind slowly, almost naturally, as though it was the next logical step in a journey he had already started. He began imagining scenarios, what it would feel like to step into someone's path, what it would be like to interrupt the routines he had memorized so carefully. These thoughts frightened him at first, but the fear quickly turned into something else: excitement. The ordinary man who had once lived in the shadows of his own life was now feeding on the possibility of becoming something more. The moment came on a damp, moonless night when the streets were nearly deserted. Daniel followed the familiar jogger into the park, his heart pounding with a mix of terror and anticipation. She was alone, her footsteps steady, her world narrowed by music in her ears. Daniel picked up a heavy stone from the path and in one sudden motion struck her down. The silence that followed seemed endless. His hands trembled, his breath came in sharp bursts, but what startled him most was the feeling that surged through his body. It was not regret. It was power. For the first time, Daniel felt visible, not to the world but to himself. The emptiness that had haunted him was replaced with a dangerous thrill. He walked away from the park that night with the certainty that something inside him had changed forever. The line between the quiet man he had been and the monster he was becoming had been crossed, and there would be no return. Town of Millbrook awoke to news that shattered its quiet routine. A young woman had gone missing after her nightly jog, and her absence left a chill in the air. Posters bearing her smiling face appeared on telephone poles and shop windows, pleading for information. Neighbors whispered at doorsteps. Parents clutched their children tighter, and police cars prowled the streets with sirens that rarely sounded in this sleepy suburb. Fear settled over Millbrook like a heavy fog, but no one looked twice at Daniel Reed. He remained at his post in the hardware store, quietly assisting customers, blending into the same unremarkable pattern he had perfected for years. While the community grew restless, Daniel thrived in the secrecy of his double life. The disappearance had sparked panic, but for him it was a reminder of his control. He read every article about the case, clipped every headline, and stored them in the same notebooks where he tracked his observations. At night, he returned to the park, standing in the same spot where the act had taken place. He lingered in the darkness, reliving the moment, savoring the rush it had given him. The police search, the worried faces, the endless speculation. They were all pieces of a performance, and only he knew the truth behind the curtain. The hunger to repeat what he had done grew unbearable. The memory of power began to fade, and he longed for the feeling again. This time, however, he wanted to be careful, deliberate, and calculated. He studied his notes, revisited his nightly walks, and identified another target. A young man who worked late shifts at a local diner caught his attention. He walked home alone after midnight, his path winding through quiet streets lined with trees. Unlike the jogger, this man was predictable in a way that felt almost too easy. Daniel mapped his route, memorized the dim streetlights, and marked the spots where shadows stretched thick across the pavement. When the night came, Daniel moved like a figure rehearsing a performance. He followed the man at a distance, waiting for the perfect moment. In the cover of darkness near a row of unlit houses, Daniel struck with precision, ensuring no noise carried into the sleeping neighborhood. The act was quick, clean, and purposeful. This time there was no shock in his hands, no trembling hesitation. He felt steady, confident, as though he had stepped fully into the role he had been preparing for all along. The body was not found immediately, and that delay only emboldened Daniel. He returned to the hardware store the next morning, calmly sorting boxes and greeting customers who spoke of nothing more alarming than a broken faucet or a missing screw. Meanwhile, the town was unraveling. First a jogger, now a young man. Two vanishings that seemed unconnected but equally terrifying. The randomness of the victims left police with no clear trail, no shared link to follow. Millbrook was no longer the safe suburb it had once claimed to be. Behind his calm exterior, Daniel savored the chaos he had created. He relished the thought that while others locked their doors in fear, he walked freely among them, unsuspected, and invisible. For him, the thrill was not only in the act itself, but in the perfect disguise he maintained. The monster within him grew stronger, and the man everyone thought they knew faded further into the background, leaving behind only a mask of ordinary life. You have not enough humanizer words left. Upgrade your surfer plan. Months that followed turned Millbrook into a place unrecognizable from the quiet town it once was. Fear seeped into every corner. Streets that had once been filled with laughter and late-night walks were now deserted after sundown. Families installed locks, alarms, and motion lights. Parents no longer allowed their children to play freely outside, and even the sound of footsteps in the dark sent waves of unease through the community. Yet in the midst of this growing paranoia, Daniel Reed remained a figure of calm routine. He continued to stock shelves, ring up customers, and nod politely at neighbors who never imagined the storm that lived behind his unassuming smile. Inside, however, Daniel had changed completely. The mask of normalcy hid a mind consumed by obsession. He no longer walked the streets merely to observe. He prowled them like a hunter. Each night he scouted potential targets with increasing confidence, marking their behaviors in his notebook with meticulous care. His notebooks had become an archive of lives, details about strangers who did not even know they were being studied. The thrill of control had grown into a need for signature, a desire to leave behind a mark that would make his presence undeniable, even if his identity remained hidden. With his third crime, Daniel introduced this mark. After taking another life, he carefully arranged objects near the scene in a strange pattern, something that seemed meaningless to others, but carried deep significance for him. It was his way of claiming ownership, of transforming a simple act of violence into something that felt like art in his twisted mind. Each new symbol became more elaborate, and soon police began to notice the repetition. They could not yet understand what the patterns meant, but they recognized that they were dealing with more than random violence. Investigators worked tirelessly, piecing together fragments of evidence, scuffed shoe prints, fibers from clothing, traces of soil out of place. They created a profile that disturbed them. The killer was not an outsider, not a drifter passing through, but someone who belonged to Millbrook. He was someone ordinary, someone who could slip unnoticed into daily life. The realization unsettled the community even more, for it meant the monster they feared was not hiding in shadows far away, but was likely standing among them in plain sight. Daniel, meanwhile, reveled in the chase. The news coverage was no longer just background noise, it was fuel. He collected every article, every televised segment, storing them alongside his notes as if they were trophies. He studied the words of reporters and detectives, delighting in how close they were to him without ever realizing it. He found joy in their frustration, in the fear that spread through his town with each new crime. But his growing pride began to cloud his judgment. He was no longer content with caution. He wanted to push boundaries to prove to himself that he was untouchable. This arrogance marked the beginning of his mistakes. He grew careless in small ways, leaving faint traces that a sharper investigator might one day recognize. Yet Daniel did not notice. To him, the game was his to control, and every night he stepped further into the role he had created. He was no longer Daniel Reed, the quiet store clerk. In his own mind, he had become something far greater, an invisible force shaping the lives of an entire town, a monster who wore the skin of a normal man. You have not enough humanizer words left. Upgrade your surfer plan. Night of Daniel's downfall began like many others, cloaked in quiet and shadow. The town was restless, its residents still reeling from the string of unexplained deaths and disappearances. Patrol cars circled neighborhoods more frequently now, and detectives moved silently, determined to catch the man who had terrorized Millbrook. They had been studying his patterns, connecting the symbols he left behind and mapping his crimes. Piece by piece, a picture had formed. They believed they could predict where he might strike next. What Daniel thought of as his greatest strength, his precision and his ritual, had become the very thing that betrayed him. Daniel spent the evening preparing for another act. He walked with confidence, the weight of his earlier crimes giving him a sense of invincibility. The target he had chosen this time was another solitary figure, someone who lived at the edge of town, where the streets fell into silence. He rehearsed the route in his mind, convinced he could carry out the plan as flawlessly as before. Yet he was unaware that detectives had already anticipated his movements. They had laid their trap carefully, hiding in the very shadows he trusted to protect him. When Daniel approached the narrow lane where his intended victim would pass, the air was heavy with tension. He clutched the object he had brought with him, ready to strike. For a brief moment he felt that familiar rush, the power of control, the thrill of anticipation. But then the silence shattered. Flashlights cut through the darkness and figures stepped out from every angle. Commands rang out, sharp and forceful, leaving him frozen in disbelief. For the first time since his transformation began, Daniel was not the predator but the prey. The arrest was swift, the evidence overwhelming. His notebooks were discovered, filled with detailed records of his victims, their routines, and his chilling thoughts. The symbols he had left at each crime scene were sketched in the margins, proof of the ritual he had believed made him untouchable. Neighbors who had once seen him as the quiet man at the hardware store were stunned as they watched him taken away in handcuffs. Some refused to believe it, while others felt the cold shock of realizing how little they had truly known about the man who lived among them. In court, Daniel sat expressionless as prosecutors unveiled the horrors of his double life. The polite smiles, the mundane conversations, the routine job, all of it had been a mask. Witnesses spoke of their shock. Investigators shared the painstaking work that had led to his capture, and the jury listened in silence as the depth of his crimes was revealed. The verdict was inevitable. Daniel Reed was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of release. But his imprisonment did not erase the fear he left behind. The people of Millbrook never forgot that the monster they had dreaded had not been a stranger lurking in the dark, but a familiar face hiding in plain sight. Parents warned their children about trust, reminding them that evil often wears the mask of normality. Daniel Reed's story became a chilling reminder that monsters are not always born. They can be made, shaped by silence, fueled by resentment, and hidden within the most ordinary of lives until the day they finally emerge. Daniel Reed's story is a chilling reminder that evil often hides behind the mask of normalcy. To neighbors, he was just a quiet clerk. To Millbrook, he became the shadow that stole peace from its streets. Emily Carter and Mark Holloway were not just names on posters. They were lives cut short, victims of a monster no one saw coming. Detective Sarah Mitchell's determination brought his reign of terror to an end, but the scars he left behind remained. Millbrook learned a truth no town ever wants to face. Sometimes the most ordinary face can hide the darkest heart.